Welcome to Autodesk Inventor Lesson 15. Here is one of the parts we worked on in Lesson 14, where we learned about the Loft command. This part is made up of a sketch of a circle, a sketch of another circle, and then the Loft command simply connects the two. There's a little bit more control we can get with the Loft command, and that's going to be the focus of this lesson. Let's look at this first example, where we can kind of see what we had before. We have a profile on this end, a profile on the other end, and they are joined. But we see a little bit of a change here. We see this curve through the middle. Here's another example where we have again a profile on one end, profile on the other end, but they are joined not by a direct loft, but we have a bulge out to the side on each side here, and then a little bit of a belly underneath. Maybe this is a sort of the hull of a boat, and we create some curvature to it instead of going just directly from one sketch to the other. So let's dive in, start creating these parts, or at least something that looks like them. See how we add that control to the Loft. Let's create our first sketch. Let's throw a rectangle up here. Let's come off the origin down and to the right. Let's make this a 2-inch square. Finish this sketch. Let's expand our origin planes, use the XY plane again here. Create a plane off of that. Let's make 6 inches. We'll create our next sketch here. Let's make another square right here, but let's make this one 1.5 by 1.5. There we go. Finish that sketch. So as before, let's make that plane invisible. As before, we have two closed profiles. We can come in here, we can create a loft between them, but that just goes directly from one to the other. We want to undo that and add a little bit more control. Let's sketch on the XZ plane, so that will be sitting right on top of this. Create a new sketch on the XZ plane. And let's draw between these endpoints. Let's go up, click and drag to create an arc. We'll make another arc. We can click and drag and create arcs all the way along. Get up here. Let's finish that. I need to project geometry to get that endpoint. Notice what happened here when I create that endpoint. It gives me the crosshairs here. I don't necessarily need the crosshairs. That comes from up here, this little center point button. I don't need a center point. I just need a point. I'm going to turn that off. I'm going to project geometry again, and that is projecting an endpoint. Let's turn a little bit so we can see. It just projects an endpoint from that sketch. So now I can add a constraint. Coincident constraint that puts that endpoint directly on that point that I created. Let's put some dimensions on these lines in between. Doesn't really matter all that much what they are, just so long as everything is constrained and we have control over it. If we want to come back and change dimensions, change that curvature, then we can certainly do that. Let's finish this 2D sketch. So now we have a square here, we have a square here, and we have a curved path connecting them. Let's try Loft again. Starts the same way. Square to square, we get that direct loft. But over here on the right side, we have the option to add rails. Now a rail is just going to give us a guide to kind of pull that loft out of its original shape. It's ready to select a sketch. When I click on that sketch, it takes the whole thing and alters that path to take that square, take the shape it was generating end to end, and stretch it out to the right side a little bit. That was a loft with one extra sketch as a rail. Let's add a little bit more complexity to it. We'll create another new part. Let's make a new sketch here. Let's make this one. Sketch this one just below the origin, so I can use my coincident constraint to put the center point of this top line on the origin. That'll keep it centered. Let's make it 3 inches wide, 1 inch tall. That rectangle is constrained, so I can finish that sketch. Let's look at our origin planes again. We know we started on XY. Let's create a plane off of there. Let's drag that out 6 inches and create a new sketch. Let's do just like what we did before, but create a different size rectangle. A coincident constraint again to stick it to the origin. Let's make this one 4 inches wide and 1.25 inches tall, 1.25. Finish that sketch. Now we're back to our setup where we have two profiles that we could connect with a loft. Click one, click the other. But we want to add some control to where these edges go. So let's undo that. And let's add another sketch to the top of this. I started this, if you notice, below. There is my XZ plane. I started all of this below an axis so that I know I have my XZ plane on top and it's easy to sketch on that. So start that sketch there. Let's put in a couple of arcs. I can't connect anything yet. I need to project geometry. Now let's get just the endpoints. Let's undo that. Turn off that center point again. Okay. Project geometry. Point to point. Get those 2 points. Now let's add our arc here. 8 looks good. Let's pick up these endpoints, put another arc here, and we will give it a dimension. Click back on that 8 so they are the same. And that's going to give us some control of the sides of this loft between the two. Maybe we're creating a hull of a boat. And that will give us some curvature and a nice boat shape. Let's look here. Let's add our rails, select a sketch, it is ready. I click one side of that sketch, it shifts everything out to the left. But I click this other side, and now it stretches both sides out. So I've got both sides of this boat bulging out a little bit, but notice it still has a flat bottom because I can add even more control. Let's hit undo. So it takes that loft off of there, and we're going to sketch one more time, this time on the XZ plane. Create a new sketch. I want to project geometry to my sketch again. Let's get rid of that center point again. It keeps popping up. It may or may not on yours. Let me do something. Let me get out of sketch mode. Go back in. Edit this sketch. Turn off that center point. See if it really goes away now. We project geometry. Get that endpoint, that endpoint. That puts both of these points on my sketch. I say OK. Go back to my right side view looking directly into it. And let's add this arc. Now I can come up here to my view cube. Let's hit this little arrow here to rotate. If this looks more like the way we would look at a boat, so that this is the bottom of our boat, let's give that a radius of 12. If we want a little more subtle curvature, we can always come back, edit that dimension, make that number bigger. Say OK. Finish that 2D sketch. Now what we have on our screen, starting to look a little bit messy with all the dimensions up there, but we have two profile sketches, two different size rectangles, one at each end. Then we have the two arcs here that define the sides, and then we have this one underneath. Let's create the loft. Rectangle, rectangle, there's the basic shape, and let's start adding rails. Left side, right side. And when we pick up the bottom, now we have all the curves that we were looking for. Maybe we can make this a little more pronounced, more visible. Let's take that sketch. Let's make this 9. That'll give a little more curvature to that. A little more belly out the bottom. We can go back and edit the first sketch. 0.5 and a 2. Finish that sketch. See, everything adapts, everything updates when we change that sketch. Maybe we want to come in and add a fillet to each of these edges, round those off. Whatever we want to do. Play with the things that we have learned. Use Loft. Use multiple sketches. Use some rails to create different shapes. Adjust the numbers. Get a feel for it. And we'll see you in lesson 16.